So we've got a small fireside chat here. Thoughts on regulatory peace proposal for blockchain and crypto. We've got Steve Lofchie, who's a partner at Fried Frank. Steve counsels SEC and CFTC regulated entities like broker-dealers, advisors, funds, and markets of various types and sizes. And Steve's transactional practice focuses on OTC, derivatives, securities financing, and trading agreements, and various types of licensing and membership agreements. He's also referred to as, by many as the Dean of the Securities Bar. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us here at the Digital Assets and Securities Conference, and looking forward to your conversation with my partner Gautam. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Steve. So guys, we've been talking a lot about like the operational aspects of issuance, of secondary market trading, of settlement, and everything that goes into a securities trade. And we thought that this time that we have together with Steve, and Steve, thanks for being here, we take a step back, okay? Just take a step back and see what's the overall landscape in Washington, because there's a in not so much in the states, but in Washington in particular. What's going on the Hill, what's going on with the SEC, the CFTC, the Federal Reserve Board, the Treasury Department, like all these different people that are actually trying to claim a piece of this, and to see like what we can discern from that. And for that, I'd really recommend you do a search on Steve, okay? Because he's written some really, really cool pieces, like really good thought pieces on what the future might look like, or should look like, or what people should be considering, right? So Steve, just so you guys know, we've been working together. Steve's been my outside counsel in my pre-digital era for over 20 years, and like me, shares our love for blues music. Okay, so he's not just a lawyer; he's a cool dude. Okay, so Steve, with that, tell me what your thoughts are. Like, what's going on? Where do you think this is headed? Are people going to see it our way?
Well, first of all, excuse me. Let me say how important the conference is, because it's getting past, hey, we're really digital, we're not really subject to the securities laws or other regulations, and it's really kind of accepting that Washington is not going away, and that there may be some loosening at the edges, but for the most part, you're going to have to figure out how you fit into an existing regulatory scheme. That scheme may change a bit, it may loosen a bit, but it is not going away. So, in some ways I thought it'd just be useful to kind of start at the top. The president, or the big guy, as Hunter Biden refers to him as, where is he in terms of federal policy? So there was an executive order on the government's treatment of digital assets, which I think was viewed, and I'm going to say mistakenly, by people in the industry as being extremely significant, saying, hey, look, the president is paying attention to us, this is really great, but if you read what the executive order said, I think that the term word salad, this was more like of a policy salad. There was really nothing in the way of definitive statements in it. So either digital was just the coolest thing that was going to drive the financial industry for the next however long and was going to reshape America, or it was a den of iniquity in which payments were being made to criminals to buy drugs and to finance terrorism. And whichever it was, something was going to be done about it. The only thing that I think you could really take out of the executive order was a very strong suggestion, and I think this really relates to the prior gentleman talking about crypto, was a very strong suggestion that the Fed was looking at a U.S. central bank digital currency. So if you go down the regulators in Washington, you know, the Fed is not really directly, I'll say, in our market, in our day-to-day lives, but Fed is the single most important regulator in Washington because they regulate the big banks. And the big banks are the single most important type of financial institution. So the Fed is trying to figure out what to do with stablecoin. And there are different types of stablecoin, the algorithmic stablecoin, what I would call asset-backed stablecoin, which is kind of the Tether type product, and then you have, excuse me, a dollar-based stablecoin or a currency-based stablecoin. Thanks, Gautam. So I think the algorithmic stablecoin has taken something of a blow. The asset-backed stablecoin like Tether, I mean, Tether itself clearly illegal under the U.S. securities laws. So clearly an investment company. The SEC could facilitate the creation of money market fund type investment companies that would be blockchain based if it wanted to do so, if the Fed gave it the go. But where I think the banking regulators are really going to go, my guess is a U.S. central bank digital currency. And I think you can view, if you're cynical or the SEC kind of clearing the way for the central bank digital currency to be the main payment form in the digital asset market. I think that has some real upsides and some real downsides. The real upside, again, to pick up on the prior panel, is it really starts to separate out the cryptocurrency issues from the product issues, from the operational issues, and it gives you, you know, a single way to pay for assets. It deals with a lot of issues like tax issues. You know, what's a taxable event? Right now, when I move from any one digital asset to another, every time I dispose of a digital asset, that is probably a taxable event. By bringing everything back to dollars really simplifies things. The downside is if you are somewhat cynical or suspicious of government, as I actually tend to be, it means eventually you're going to end up with a system where everything flows through the banks and where there is really very little, I think, expectation of privacy. So the whole notion that, you know, crypto becomes kind of this, you know, under the cover goes away. It means that everything ultimately becomes transparent. Maybe there's process around that, but at the end of the day, everything becomes transparent to the government.
But wouldn't that mean that, you know, if you were the regulator and that was a desirable goal, because I'm sure it is to them, right? Wouldn't that mean that you would actually be actively trying to destroy all other kinds of stable coins and just have the CBDC?
It is a desirable goal to the government. The government, you know, wants utter transparency, and look, I do think that, again, if you're cynically inclined, as I can be, I think you can view the SEC as very much taking steps to, you know, to ensure that there really will not be in the United States competitors to the U.S. CBDC. Now, again, for the people in this room, that's probably largely, as an economic matter, not a bad thing. It means that there is a simple, direct way to interact in the in the digital environment. Again, the downside is more big picture. It means a complete, eventually, transparency to the government as to how money is spent.
So, what is, in your view, going on the Hill with respect to this?
So on the Hill, I think you can take it as somewhat of a Democrat-Republican split, with sorry, the leaders on the Democrat side being Warren and Brown, Sherrod Brown of Pennsylvania, and they are very much in the the anti-crypto camp. And then you have Toomey on the Republican side, who is far more open. I think if you were looking for help on the Hill, I'd be very much looking to Toomey, potentially McHenry. I mean, there's only a limited amount, by the way, that the Congress people can do, being in a minority position, both in Congress and not controlling the agencies. But it's meaningful. So, and you have Warren very much pushing, crypto is the way money is laundered, crypto is too volatile, that it is kind of the den of iniquity position. Recently, Senator Warren and one of the senators from Minnesota, not Klobuchar, I can't remember her name, came out with a piece or a letter to Fidelity, essentially, really going after Fidelity, which is, after all, for Warren, a home state financial institution, challenging why they were making it easier, why Fidelity was making it easier for retirees to put assets into, not just retirees, but people in their retirement plans putting assets into digital. So, Senator Warren's not your friend, Senator Brown's not your friend. You have some allies, but they are in the minority. The agencies that are on kind of the middle, I would say, to some extent, are the banking regulators. Again, I think the Fed is looking for CBDC, for central bank digital currency. I think the OCC with Anchorage is a really interesting development. I know there was some discussion of broker-dealer custody of digital assets. My personal view with Gensler at the SEC is that is not a near-term event. And so if you are looking for a regulated institution to hold your digital assets, it is not going to be broker-dealers. The SEC is very far away from that. That custody piece they put out was, interesting reading, I suppose, if you're a legal geek as I am, but in terms of real world, not going to happen, and not very much value there. But I think the Anchorage development of getting a bank to hold digital assets, and potentially other banks may follow, tremendously significant. And the ability, for example, to trade through an ATS, but custody and settle with a bank, that's what I would be focusing on in terms of moving digital assets around, not broker-dealer custody. You don't have a friend at the SEC who is going to facilitate broker-dealer custody. But and again, that's why this conference is so important, because it's kind of pulling together, the infrastructure, whether it's the transfer agents, the ATSs, the custodians, the products that are represented by digital. You're going to need that in order to create an operational system that complies with all the various regulators.
Right, and we all appreciate that, and that is a it's almost like somebody's throwing stones into your path, because otherwise the technology would be working much more smoothly the way it's intended to. But this is a roadblock that's being put in front of us, right? But we're dealing with it, so you've heard that, right, in the operations section of the different panels that we've had here.
No, absolutely. And by the way, I think that some of the ways people are focusing on how you offer digital assets through Reg A+, I think that's also hugely important, because what that is going to do is to create a set of products that can be legally traded on ATSs because they have been legally sold as securities. One of the issues for the exchanges is going to be, how do you deal with this, mix of products, some of which, like the ones sold, in a Reg A+ offering, clearly legal securities, and you heard one up here talking about opinions, they are all good under the securities laws. They can clearly trade, assuming that you go through all the steps, those $5,000 for legal opinions, all of that, but they can clearly legally trade, and then there's going to be potentially a kind of ghetto of assets where their legal provenance is not clear. They were not sold in a registered or clearly exempt offering. They weren't sold under Reg A+, or so were they originally sold, as illegal unregistered securities, and therefore, if you're an ATS, you may be very nervous about touching those because you have an aiding and abetting issue in terms of facilitating them. But once you have like a real base of assets that can be legally traded because they were done in a Reg A+ offering or they were properly sold in private placements, that's where I think the market really starts to take off.
That's great. So in terms of like some of the other regulators that have a stake in this, right? Let's start with the CFTC, right? What do you think the CFTC wants? What do you think it's going to be able to get? And what's the time frame in your view?
I mean, the CFTC is thinking, oh, here is this vast field of unregulated assets, some of which are, commodities, and hey, shouldn't I get to regulate them? And therefore, shouldn't I be more powerful?
But do they currently? I'm not sure this is working.
So the CFTC does not regulate commodities. They have anti-fraud authority. They only regulate derivatives on commodities. So Bitcoin futures. They don't regulate Bitcoin other than to the extent that there's a fraud. The CFT is not going to become the primary regulator of digital assets. For the most part, they're either going to fall under the banking world as stablecoin, they're going to be securities, or they'll just be ordinary assets, like which are regulated under state law or commercial law. I don't see it realistic that anyone is going to grant the CFTC some general jurisdiction over digital assets. For one thing, it would be cutting in too closely into the SEC's world, because the SEC is is going to the SEC and the CFTC jurisdiction is kind of, it's either one or the other. It's not going to go to the CFTC. It's going to go to it's not going to go to the CFTC.
Okay.
So the CFTC will take derivatives on digital assets. So that means things like Bitcoin swaps. Those fall into the CFTC's jurisdiction. It is meaningful, but really, it's kind of, I think, for people in this room, from the panels I've seen, it's kind of a side issue at best. It's really the SEC that is the regulator that you care about and that you're going to be dealing with.
So today, if I want to trade Bitcoin, I don't have to worry about the CFTC at all? I can build build a trading platform and just trade Bitcoin or any other crypto?
Well, so the question for any other crypto is it, is it an illegal product? So Bitcoin, I think there's sort of general consensus that as much as Gary wishes he could have been able to shut it down, it's a legal product. So you've got money transfer regulation, you've got AML, but Bitcoin, not a security. If you're trading the cash market product, it's not going to be subject to the CFTC, excuse me, in the absence of fraud. Can't really make a, you can't really, not sure you can make a significant enough business trading Bitcoin alone. So that's really the limiter. But Bitcoin is probably the one product that you can say with absolute confidence that the SEC will not go after as being a security. I mean, there are others you can feel reasonably safe about, but Bitcoin's the only one you can feel absolutely confident in.
So, look, I want to get back to something you were talking about earlier about the word salad, right? When I read that, okay, when I read the president's order, I was looking at it going, okay, so 180 days to come back to you, to come back to the big guy with all of these solutions, right? And I was just being my cynical self, thinking like, all they're going to come back with is saying, hey, Mr. President, what a great order, and we're going to need to examine the following things in greater detail, and we're going to work together with the other agencies in examining those things, and we'll come back to you at a time when you may not be president anymore.
Look, again, I think the only thing the executive order, to read the tea leaves was central bank digital currency. I think one of the interesting things, and again, it was a mention on the last panel about ESG. So, one of the kind of little jibes thrown in, excuse me, to the executive order was that Bitcoin is not energy efficient. And, again, I took that as a signal that the government's going to be coming after Bitcoin. And so you see that from Elizabeth Warren and her statements to Fidelity. I think you'll potentially see that to SEC attacks, not on Bitcoin as being a security, because Bitcoin, as I said, is clearly safe in that regard, but attacks potentially on the markets that trade Bitcoin and other products on the view that those other products are illegal securities and therefore that those markets are acting improperly. Again, lots of tax uncertainty around digital. Every time you move from from one asset to another, you've got a tax event. So there's lots of ways in which the government can discourage trading in Bitcoin and, kind of not just Bitcoin, but push the market towards CBDC. And again, I really do think that for people in this room, long term, leaving aside privacy concerns, and I don't want to minimize privacy concerns because I think the government has a tendency to be enormously overreaching, but in terms of just commercial ease, CBDC has a lot of upside for the people in the room.
That's great. Now, if I can just switch gears for a second, right? We've been talking a little bit about how this whole move towards digital securities can improve secondary market liquidity for, privately placed assets. One of the places where you have a lot of privately placed assets are banks, and banks they need to maintain capital ratios, and one of the things that they have to show sufficiently is HQLA, highly liquid assets, right? we don't think that these private assets will ever qualify as HQLA, but do you think that if you digitize them and place them on ETSs, that you could then do a collateral upgrade trade with those private assets for maintaining HQLA? Because that's just an area that, we don't see too many people focused on.
Well, look, even stocks don't qualify as HQLA, so take that off the table, but the more that you can move assets around and legally pledge them, the more valuable that they are. So, when the question came up, when do you start thinking about secondary market liquidity? Jesus, I don't have a client that would ever try to raise money without thinking about secondary market liquidity. I mean, eventually, what good is an asset if you can't turn it into cash one way or the other? So you need to be able to custody safely. You need to be able to pledge your asset. And right now, I do think the way that we're moving in terms of big picture institutional use is bank custody. And, it's all very good to wish for broker-dealer custody, but that's not an immediate thing that is going to happen. So go with bank custody. Banks can just take fees for acting as custodians, and then you have private lenders out there which can take a good security interest in assets held at the bank. So there is a way to go, and really, again, I'm going to come back to, that's, I think, the really great thing about this conference. It really is thinking about, hey, we're going to concede that we're subject to laws, might not like it, might prefer the Wild West, might want rules, but Washington is not going away. And right now, there is a very good avenue towards bank custody. And as you think about processes, that's what I would be focused on.
Okay. Well, looks like Dave is indicating that we are out of time over here. So thank you very much, Steve, for showing up and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you.